working with such a diverse.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you might be. My name is Francis O'Rourke. I'm here today with the final day of the RSN Spring Conferences presented by WPI. It's been an amazing 4 days so far, and I'm looking forward to all the great presenters we have here today for our last day. First up, though, we've got our first presenter. His name is Mike Corsetto, and he's here to talk to us about goal setting. Mike, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure thing. So my name is Mike Corsetto. I have been a mentor of Team 1678 since 2008. I'm an engineering manager at solar technology company SunPower, developing robots that clean solar panels. I was a student in FRC as well, so this 2020 marked my 17th season in FRC.
All right.
And yeah, just excited to be here and presenting some topics on goal setting.
Yeah. I'm really eager to see what you have to say about this, because I know that a lot of teams struggle with this, and even teams that can set goals well maybe don't hold to them all that well. So this is going to be something I'm paying very close attention to. But before we begin, I want to say a big thank you to WPI for helping to make this whole thing possible. WPI, or Worcester Polytechnic Institute, is a leader in project-based education and was the first university to offer not only a Bachelor's of Science, but also a Master's and a PhD in robotics engineering. If you're interested in becoming a student, or if you want to help to sponsor one of those great projects that WPI hosts, you can find out more information at wpi.edu. Last but not least, we're taking your questions in the chat. So if you've got a question for Mike during the course of the presentation, just send it on in chat with the command !Q followed by your question. And also, Mike's going to have some other call-outs during the presentation, so make sure you stay in the chat and stay active, because he's going to want to hear from what you guys have to say and what your teams do now. All right, with all that out of the way, Mike, why don't you go ahead and get us started, and let's hear about goal setting.
Sounds great. So let me break down a little bit of what we're going to go through today. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of goal setting in the FRC context. So what have teams in the program been doing historically, and how have we gotten to this point where we're talking about goal setting on a more team holistic level? We'll talk about where goal setting meets strategic design, because I feel like sometimes teams might think, one thing is another thing with those two topics. So we're going to talk about how they interface, where one ends, where the other begins. We'll go through some of the bigger questions around goal setting. And then we're going to get a little bit more into practical application elements of this topic. So we're going to talk about what are the types of goals that teams can set for themselves, the process that teams can use to set those goals, and then ways that teams can measure their effectiveness at meeting those goals. So we're going to go through those topics step by step. Like you mentioned, Francis, I'm really hoping to hear from teams. So we do have a little chat activity for like the first half of the talk. So I'll be asking for, some answers to this about partway through the talk when we get to that spot. But in the chat right now, if you're listening and you're on an FRC team, share one or more of your team's goals in the chat. And if you don't know what your team's stated goals might be, share one goal that you think might be a goal of your team's based on the way your team is formed and how your team operates. And then also it'd be great to hear an example of how your team met that goal maybe last season. I know we had a short season last season, but maybe there's a goal that your team set that you can look back on and say, hey, you know what? We set this goal for ourselves at the beginning of the year and we met it. So if you have that experience as well, feel free to share that. But I'd love to see some examples of teams sharing the goals their own teams have in the chat. So let's talk a little bit about the history of this. So, way back in the beginning of the program, when I was a student, the program was a lot smaller. It was a lot newer and younger. And, I think there was not a lot of best practices being shared across teams and through the program. It was a lot harder back then to do that. So, a lot of teams, my own team included, pretty much just went into each year without any sort of really strict plan or process. Even 1678 for a number of seasons, even all the way probably I'd say up through 2011, kind of went into every year winging it for the most part. A lot of our leadership and team structure was set on kickoff day. And I think that, kind of echoes how a lot of teams ran their program, especially in the early days of FRC. And processes weren't really well defined in general, not just as an overall team operation, but how you approach a season specifically. So in 2005, 1114 released a white paper that they called Strategic Design. And from that point, I think Karthik especially has been a huge advocate for setting parameters for your team's approach to a given year's game. And he encourages a lot of good processes through that mentality of strategic design, including things like weighing your own team's resources and incorporating limitations of your team into how you approach a given season and a given game with the robot that you want to build. And then from that point, I think teams began to realize on a more broad level that, hey, it's actually really important that we have good processes and methods set out to approach each season. And although every year's game is different, a lot of the principles that make teams successful can be carried over year to year. And so I think that's where we started to see teams begin thinking a little bit more about how to set overall program goals. And so I think that's where we've gotten to this point now, where I think a lot of teams are aware of strategic design and the processes of strategic design. But I think where a lot of teams still have room to improve in is how they set goals as a team and aim to meet those goals and then measure those goals. So that kind of is the background for how we got to this point. I just want to review a little bit of strategic design to talk about there's a little bit of team goals baked into strategic design when you go into a season. So the inputs of the strategic design process that teams go through at the beginning of the season, usually, in the days immediately following kickoff, those inputs obviously include the game. You need to know what the game is and study the game. We mentioned team resource levels being one of the other very key elements of strategic design. So things like, what's the size of your team? I call it your workforce size, but basically how many students and mentors and parents, do you have to kind of throw at this problem and put towards developing a solution? What's the level of experience on the team, either in industry or in FIRST and other robotics programs specifically? Equipment and manufacturing resources, it's a big one. What's your facility like? How much space do you have? What's your team budget? How much can you actually afford to reach for? Do you have real limitations with regards to how far you can go? So that's like kind of the second big element. But I think the third one, which is going to blend into overall team goals, is what your robot goals are. And Karthik talks a lot about this too, and we've learned a lot from him in this regard. Is what are you actually trying to accomplish with the robot as a team? And that's going to help dictate the things that you decide to build for with your robot and how you compete.
And real quick, for those of you who are listening now, Karthik did his strategic design or effective first strategies presentation yesterday on the conference. So if you want to view that after Mike's done, you can go find that on the RSN YouTube channel.
Yeah, highly recommend. Anytime you can get to listen to Karthik speak is worth the time.
Oh, yeah.
So examples of robot goals, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, these goals can be like result driven. So it could be as a team, we're setting a goal that we want to make it into the playoffs, the elimination matches at all of the events that we go to. So if we go to 2 district events, maybe we won't end up going to district championships, but we're really hoping to play at least in the quarterfinals at both those district events. These robot goals can also be like statistically driven. So maybe you're not as worried about your on-field results, but you want to ensure that your robot performance is at a certain level. So there's all sorts of objective metrics. And now that the FMS is pumping out all sorts of data, you can even look back and see, hey, how consistent were we at climbing this year, right? And you could have a robot goal that said, we want to be able to climb in every single match that we play in, right? Or we want to be climb and balanced in every single match that we play in. So these are the sorts of goals that you can set for the robot, but those goals can also be more abstract. We want to use our robot as a platform to become a more well-known team, in the FRC community, right? Maybe there's a desire to stand out amongst the competition. So if that's a team goal of yours, you're going to look at the game and your resources, and with that goal as the third element of we want to stand out, your overall product is going to look slightly different. Maybe you're going to build a robot that isn't 100% optimized to seed number one, but it has an element that's going to make it stand out and be unique in the field, and maybe it's going to generate some more attention towards your team's like build process, etc. I think a good example of this is teams using their resources and kind of their branding to. Some teams build very interesting robots out of interesting build materials. I think there's teams that build like 75% of the robot out of polycarb, or there's the PVC pirates who it's in their name to build things out of PVC, and they do it right.
Yep.
I mean, those teams are super cool, and you can list them off because they're well known, and they have a process that they use. And I don't know if it's a stated goal on their teams that we will have at least 2 mechanisms that heavily utilize PVC, but whatever they're doing, they're pretty consistent at it, and they've made a name for themselves. So cool things like that you can do as a team to set a robot goal that will be incorporated into your strategic design. But this is kind of an overall team goal in a way. So your team goals will influence your strategic design process. So I think I might have just repeated myself a little bit, but the strategic design process is a very defined process, and a lot of teams are following that now. It's great, and a lot of that is due to Karthik's great work year over year at giving that championships talk and posting those videos online, because I know a ton of teams use that resource extensively to inform their build season process. But again, the reason we're talking today is because I think there's a lot of room for teams to improve in how they set overall team goals. So we're going to go through that process of trying to set goals that are both achievable and meaningful for each individual team. And a lot of this is going to be based on some of the same inputs as strategic design. So what are your team's resources? What are your teams? What's your team makeup? What schools does your team pull from? What adult industry experience does your team have? What community needs does your team have specifically? A lot of teams come from different backgrounds and have specific needs. So a lot of team goals are going to be informed by those things. So the strategic design process, just so we can clarify, it sets a priority list that acts as a map for your competition season. This goal setting is going to set the direction for your entire team outside or beyond the scope of the season and the robot. This is going to set a trajectory for your entire team for your entire year. And because these goals, these overall team goals are going to influence how you build your robot in the strategic design process, it's important that these goals are set early. It's important that you have these goals set before the season starts, because you want to be, for the season specifically, you want to be building off of a broader set of team goals that you set for yourself before the season. But like I just said, these goals are going to go beyond just what you build with the robot, and we're going to talk about that. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of goals. Well, let's take a quick step back and talk about why we're doing this. Some of the big elements of goal setting that have really helped 1678 through the last, I'd say 6 or 7 years, and I think are the big takeaways for teams as far as why they should even spend time doing this. Because to be honest, I know a lot of people that are listening are probably really excited about building robots, or really excited about programming, or really excited about business development and those sorts of subjects. And this sort of step back, bigger picture might seem a little bit too abstract, and also a little bit like, why do we need to be focusing on this stuff? But let me try to make my best pitch I can for why what we're talking about in this process of goal setting is something that's worthwhile for people to spend time on. From my perspective, goal setting, explicit goal setting gives you the opportunity as a team to be aligned towards a common set of goals, but really a common purpose. Especially, I found on 1678, goal setting is incredibly important for getting buy-in from your leadership team. a lot of times teams can be built up or torn down by the function or dysfunction of their leadership group. And so it's important to have a clear set of goals in place so that your leadership team can work together cohesively and towards a common purpose. Goal setting is also great to use as a conflict resolution tool. So one thing I love about explicitly setting out goals is now that you have a guiding principle or a list of principles that you're trying to achieve with your team, it's much easier to see when people are diverting from those set list of goals, and it gives you the opportunity to gently guide them back in to the path that your team is going on, right? I think teams do this in the season a lot with their strategic design, where they'll say, hey, we're not going to go underneath the wheel of fortune or whatever that thing was. We're explicitly going tall, right? And then someone comes in a week later and says, hey, I got an overall design idea that would also let us go under the wheel of fortune, right? It's easier for the rest of the team to say, kind of pull them and be like, hey, that's awesome. It's cool you had that idea. But as a team, we've set this direction for ourselves, right? And you can do the same thing with team goals, right? It just allows you to see areas in your team where maybe one or more team members are heading in a direction that doesn't line up with the common purpose that you've established as a team early on in your season. And so it allows you to guide them back in and realign people throughout your season as you try to set out for these goals that you've set for yourselves. It also really lets you delegate a lot better. So, 1678 now is a team of, nearly 100 students every year and, between 10 to 15 adults. And, we have a very clear set of goals for our own team. And because we're so consistent about stating what those goals are, we've tried to make tools that make it easier for the students to remember that. So we have like a motto that's educate, empower, excel, right? Just 3 words. Try to make it as easy to remember as possible and it doesn't, obviously, that doesn't explain 100% of what we're trying to do as a team, but it's just one more tool that we try to use to remind our huge team what we're trying to accomplish together. And what that means is now that more students on the team, not just the students at the tippy top of the pyramid, but now that more students throughout the entire program have an understanding of what we're trying to do, it lets us delegate things a lot better because we can know that those students have at least some understanding of where we're heading, and they can make decisions based off of their understanding of our team's goals. And so the clearer you are about your team's goals, the easier it's going to be to trust students that may be younger, newer, less experienced to set out on task and say, hey, you know what, this is their first time trying to organize an outreach event. But because we've been hammering in what our team goals are for the last 5 years, and they've been on the team for 6 months, they've heard this a million times already, and we can trust that they're going to execute on this outreach program as effectively as they can in alignment with our team goals. Increasing your delegation capacity is synonymous with a broader impact. So, I feel very lucky to have a team that is, focused on the same things. And because we're 100 students strong, we have the ability to, run summer camps with hundreds of students year over year. And that's really only because of the power we have with so many students that are so excited about our team's goals and willing to invest their time and energy into helping the team meet those goals. So it's a really exciting thing to see when you're able to delegate effectively, to see what students are really capable of, and watch leadership students delegating tasks to younger students and seeing how that whole process works to have everybody be able to play a part in what we're trying to do as a team. And it lets you support a more complicated organization. I think you study, a lot of top teams, and their organizations are multifaceted, tons of different operations running in parallel. You have parent organizations, you have students reaching out to sponsors, you have students that are doing building and programming all over the place. And it allows you to support those broader, more complicated organizations because your team, and especially your leadership team, is aligned. Okay, so we are back to our chat activity. I'd love to hear some examples of team goals. So, Francis, do we have a couple examples we can talk about?
Yeah, sure. And just to let you know as well, I shared a doc with you if you want to take a look as well. But I'll read off a couple
Killer.
right here. So first up, we got a goal here. This is from, let's see here. This is an interesting one. Well, let's talk about this one quickly because I think this will be fast. The user 9off case says their goal is to win all of their matches, win our district event, win state champs, win their division, and win world champs. It's a very lofty goal, I'll say.
Yeah, and that's definitely in that category of a robot goal, right?
Yeah.
They clearly have a performance metric that they're trying to hit. That's awesome.
Right. Let's see here. We've got Eric Orlowski. He says for team 2830, increase student participation and engagement, set students up for success with college and career, promote STEM, and educate the Milwaukee community. It's a lot of facets to that goal.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, I really like that. Yeah, it's definitely got a couple elements to it. Different. You could break that down a little bit and break it into a couple of I guess sub goals in a way. But it really does capture a lot of. You get a good idea of what they're trying to do with their program with a list of goals like that.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
So Caltran 420. Their goal that they put down. General goal is just to play on Saturday afternoon. Another performance-based goal, but do you think a performance-based goal like that can be more of a team goal? Do you think that there's an aspect to the greater team than just how the robot performs?
Certainly, like I would say, to a team with a goal like that, I imagine, Caltrans doing this, but you want to set that goal for your team in August, right? Because that's gonna dictate not just how you build your robot, but how you prepare for your season. Right. It's going to dictate, what resources do you try to build before the season starts? What's important for your team to understand going into the season. Hopefully, with the team goal of wanting to play Saturday afternoon, you're looking not just at, how do we build a good robot? What you're looking about is how do we build the right robot, right? Because you don't have to be the best team at the event to play on Saturday afternoon, right?
That's
you
true.
just have to be the right team. And I think what we find is some teams, they may have the resources to play on Saturday afternoon, but maybe they have different goals, or maybe they don't have any really clear team goals at all, and they build the wrong robot, and they're not being picked for Saturday afternoon play, right? Where I think we see examples year over year. I think about what was the team last year from Texas? I think from PNW, the team that was super low robot that just had a level 1 hatch panel score, and they played defense, and then they did those flippy flips onto level 3 platform. Are you aware of the team?
Yeah.
64-43 or something like that?
Yes. I'm like, they were at IRI this year and at Chase Champs too.
That team, I don't know how their team is operating, but you can see how they had a vision for how their season was going to run, and they set out for that. But I can think of a lot of teams, especially because I'm familiar with the teams in California, that they set goals for themselves of just maybe seeding in the top 10, and so they're looking at what do teams that consistently seed in the top 10 do. It goes way beyond just the robot you build. It goes to how you operate your team, the priorities you set, the driver practice, all those things. Yeah. Maybe we can do one more, Francis. That was great.
Yeah, sure. One more is going to be tough. There's a lot of great ones in here. Let's see here. Here, I guess I'll go with the hometown favorite here. So this is from Emerson on 148, and she says that 148's goal: have fun, make friends, chase excellence. Very
That's great.
Yeah, it's very. I like it because it is kind of like vague to a certain extent. It doesn't have any specificity to it, right? But it does lay out a very clear path for their team, it seems.
Yep. And I'm sure, if you ask 148, that I'm sure they have more meat on those bones as far as like how they flesh that out, year over year. But yeah, kind of in a very similar vein to what I mentioned earlier about our team motto, it's meant to be a guiding principle for the whole program.
Yeah.
So stuff like that's really cool to see. Okay, well, that was awesome. Maybe we can go, if we have time at the end of the Q&A, maybe we can go back and look at a couple more of those. Those are really fun. I wanted to thank everybody for sharing that. A reason why, I thought it was important to share some of those examples from teams is because a lot of goals that you set as a team can be kind of divided into different categories, and it can help as a team to think about these categories when you look at setting goals for your own team, and honestly try to have an answer for each category, right? Or multiple answers, multiple dimensions to it. But I think it's important that, especially FRC being more than just about the robots, it's important to set team goals that cover the whole program. And I'll be honest, probably one of the best ways to be competitive on the field is having clear team goals across all these elements so that your team can cohesively operate throughout the whole season. I think that detail in particular can often get lost on especially students and mentors that are really enthusiastic about building robots, but don't understand why they need to waste time with team builders and setting up a good parent group and things like that. But I'll tell you what, like those things in your corner can be like some of your biggest assets into being a competitive program. So it's important to evaluate each of these types and really consider what your goals are for each of these. So we heard I think the example from 2830. It was a great example of some student outcome related goals. They talk specifically about increasing student participation and engagement. That's great, and every FRC team, we're trying to inspire the next generation of science and technology innovators and leaders. This is a huge one for every team to be considering. What are your student outcome goals? What are you hoping a graduate of your program is going off and doing, right? Like what are you hoping for there? Community impact is a big one, and encourage teams to think way beyond the Chairman's Award. The Chairman's Award is not the benchmark for what community engagement looks like. Consider with your team and your specific set of resources, how can you engage the community in effective ways that further promote the ideals of FIRST, right? Gracious professionalism, inspiration. What are you doing or what goals can you set for your own team in your community to do more of that? We talked about robot related goals and we heard quite a few of them there, which is awesome. Definitely encourage every team to be setting some metric for robot goals before the season starts. And especially, you go through the strategic design process like Karthik outlines, please. Goals related to competition results, we heard some of that as well. That's another great one to, like we talked about earlier, consider at the beginning of the school year, not just at the beginning of the season. And then goals related to awards. A lot of teams, they get really excited about different awards and they prioritize those things. So I know of teams that will prepare a whole season with a robot award in mind, right? And they'll go into their competition and try to guide judge conversations towards a specific award. Maybe they really are proud of their control system, and so they're going for that innovation and control award or the autonomous award, and they seek to they work towards that goal, and they also seek to get the recognition by having a full scope plan in place to try to get that award. So definitely consider what your team's goals are in relation to the FRC award ecosystem. Oh, losing my cursor. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about the process now. How do you do this goal setting? Who should be setting your goals? How do you go through the process of brainstorming goals? And we're going to talk a little bit about, what are some of the differences between objective and subjective goals, and why is that important just to be aware of as you're going through the goal setting process. Okay, so who sets team goals? So goals should be set by the leadership of the team, and it should be based on the culture and the structure of the team. So I'd say very often the healthiest way to do this is to have some input from all leadership-esque invested parties, right? And typically for your average team, this looks like the team captain or CEO, some leadership students. Some teams have VPs of different categories or sub-team leads like on 1678. And then a lot of times, from an adult perspective, it can be a couple of key mentors and teachers or coaches that would be kind of the key adults in the room. But some teams have really involved parent groups as well. And so, maybe there's a couple of key parents on the team that would play a role in this process also. It kind of depends team to team, and every team's going to be a little bit different. But what you want to make sure is you want to make sure that you have all of the key individuals in the room for this process. And if you're having trouble determining that, I mean, you can talk to other people on your team to try to form a little bit more of a cohesive structure for what your team looks like. But this process can break down pretty quickly if only a subset of your team's like key stakeholders are in the room when goals are set, and then that's implied upon other key stakeholders in the group. This doesn't have to be a process where, you know, like you get all 110 people in the same room and set team goals together. It doesn't have to be that way, but you have to make sure the people that are going to be essential to disseminating that vision to the rest of your team, you need to make sure those individuals are in the room for goal setting. So, and like I mentioned earlier, I mentioned all these different people groups because every team is totally different, and that's completely okay. You're going to shoot yourself in the foot if you don't have a good sampling of your, key stakeholders in that room. It was basically, whatever your leadership structure looks like, just make sure the important people are there. Yep. And then it's important in that process, once you get you've identified those key people, they're all together, it's important that you reach consensus on this. Another way that this process can fall flat is if you have a couple of mentors and 6 or 8 leadership students, sitting in a circle, and you get to a point that is, maybe there's some contention there. People disagree about what the goal should be. The last thing you want to do is say, all right, we're going to take it to a vote. And, it's a 5-4 decision, but majority rules. So, you have these 4, we've already established they're key people that are in that room that don't agree with this goal that your team has just set. That's not a way to move forward in strength and unity. Like that's a way just to build more resentment and disagreement in your own ranks. So I'd encourage you as a team to work through this process together. And if you need to, hopefully you're going through this process early enough so that if something is an issue, right, or maybe there's not agreement on a certain area, like maybe you've set, team goals in 4 of those 5 categories I mentioned earlier, but you can't come to a consensus on goals in that 5th category, table it. You know what I mean? Just say, hey, you know what? We did a great work so far. Let's take some time to think about this. Everyone can go back, consider things, maybe try to see things from a different perspective. And then let's come back and chat about it again, in a week or 2. That's a very straightforward way to approach this kind of tension on these sort of topics. And because you're not in build season yet, it's a lot easier to take that time and really take the time to process. Again, this is the foundation for how you're going to grow and strengthen your team. So it's important that everyone's together on that. You want to have that buy-in. Okay, so we're setting aside time for this leadership group, these key stakeholders to write these goals out. We talked about it's important to have various types and categories of goals, like we mentioned earlier. I think every team is going to be stronger if they have goals in all those categories we talked about, because if you can capture your team's broad functions in a set of goals and say these are our guiding principles across all elements of our team, not just how we build a robot, you're going to be a much stronger program. And then I would say, this is the last kind of element to this, that some people's goals that they mentioned in the chat did a great job of doing this, which is being specific with those goals, and specific especially in what your results should be. Yeah. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how you measure that and how you know that. But in this brainstorming process, it's important not just to set the goals, but set what you want your results to be from those goals. So really important element, like, kind of maybe something that teams wouldn't think about initially when they think about goal setting as a group. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about objective goals. This is going to be pretty, clear from the title, but, for objective goals, an advantage you have in this frame is it's really easy to go back and look at past objective data if you're a veteran team, and develop some sort of baseline for your team. And I think, I don't know what Caltrans goals were based off of, but, a lot of teams are setting their performance goals for a given season based off of their past year's performances, right? And that's absolutely like the right way to approach this process. I think that we did not have our goal of winning the world championship in 2011 when we started up that season, right? We had never even made it out of the quarterfinals, right? We were ecstatic just to win our first regional, to be honest, to get our first blue banner in our team history. Over time, as our team improved, those goals progressively moved up and up, right? And to the point where now our stated goal is to win the world championship from a robot performance aspect. So consider where your team is at right now. Try to establish a level-headed baseline for your team's performance and go from there. And you can also for all these objective goals, you can look at other teams too and see what they're doing, right? See teams kind of maybe that match up with you, line up with you resource-wise or performance-wise. You can look at what they're doing and what they're reaching for and say, hey, we can learn from that and we can maybe set similar goals for ourselves. And then, like I mentioned earlier, understand that this is a year-over-year process, really. And I know that can be both encouraging and discouraging. I imagine there may be some, juniors going to be seniors next year that look at this and they say, does that mean we're not going to flip a switch overnight? And really the reality is yes, teams don't get to be, all-star teams overnight. It takes work. It takes investing in people and resources and building up a program that can compete at a high level, right? Same thing, goes for outreach goals, for our own team, our outreach in the community, especially from a youth robotics perspective, started really, really modestly in 2013, where we started one FLL team, right? And that was the full scope of our involvement in the high school robotics world in our community. And at whatever it is now, 7 years later, right? We have 190 kids signed up for summer camps, even though we're not really sure what's going to happen with those right now. But we're mentoring 30 plus youth robotics teams, and we have this program that's grown, but we had to start small. So consider where goals that your team can set that allow for growth over time and aren't necessarily expecting things to change instantly. And then this is another good insight. I think this one's from Karthik as well, because we talked a lot about this presentation in particular. Every team does have down years. Every team has years that didn't necessarily go as planned. So I don't think you necessarily need to have a recency bias to your last year's performance in how you set your goals for your upcoming season. It's important to look at your team a little bit more broadly than that. So just another note there. Okay, so subjective goals. And we heard some of these as well, which were really great in the chat. Specifically, 2830s comes to mind, this increasing student participation and engagement. That's definitely in the vein of student learning goals. And certainly there's ways that you can make those objective in some elements. I know a lot of teams will look at their graduation rates, or they'll look at the percentage of their students that are going off to STEM fields in college or into STEM careers after college. Those can all be a little bit more objective, but there are going to be subjective goals on your teams too. And that's okay, to be honest. Every goals, you need to have a lot of different goals that cover a lot of different aspects to your team. And so it's okay if some of those aren't necessarily, numbers that you can look up on the blue lines, right? Let's see. So some examples of this, we talked about alumni of the program, but also, in your team's operations, what changes or improvements does your leadership group want to see for this coming season, right? And the nice thing about, having a ton of having your leadership student stakeholders in that process is those students that are on your leadership group were students themselves, new students just a couple years earlier, right? And so they understand, hey, what were some of the really great things about this program that I really enjoyed? And what were some of the things that were really hard for me as a young student on the team, right? Maybe the training curriculum could use a bunch of improvements in certain areas to be more accessible to new students. So these are things that you can consider and try to set some goals around those sorts of improvements you want to see your team make. These goals are obviously tied back into your team's mission and culture. I would argue that these goals kind of help form that and put this more into words. So some other abstract subjective goals like team image, we talked about that way earlier in the talk of how do you like up your team profile? What's your exposure like in the community, things like that. So these can all be more soft subjective goals that your team can include in the list of goals that you're using as your guiding principles for your coming season. Okay, well, that was not supposed to be there. We'll keep rolling. Measuring goals. So we talked about the importance of setting goals, and when you set your goals, set as best you can ways that you're going to check that you've met those goals at the end of the year. So once goals are measured, are defined, they need to be checked in on. And I said at the end of the year, but in reality, team goals are something that you should be checking in on, quite often. And this could be either one thing that you could do as a key stakeholder group is you could maybe have like a monthly check-in on your team goals, right? You wrote them all down. You wrote down what your objectives were for each of those goals. And then, touch base, in October, November, December, especially in January, February, and check in on how your team is doing now that the rubber has hit the road and you guys are off in a certain direction, right? You want to make sure that you're off in that same direction that you aim to be off on when you started this whole process, right? And this checking in on is going to allow you to further steer the ship and define things a little bit better as you head down that path, so that you have the best chance of meeting those goals, right? So this process of checking in on your goals, and with the measurement standards for these goals that you've set for yourself, you can check in on those specifically, and that's going to help facilitate that guiding process that we just talked about. And another great thing to do to facilitate that measuring process and that checking in is putting these goals, on paper somewhere or posted up in your robotics room. We have a lot of different, kind of like slogans and stuff that we've slapped up in our shop that help remind students of some of the, the goals and standards that we have for our team. So it's great to have that stuff published and easily available and honestly visible, so that everyone's reminded of the standards that they've set for themselves. And, we're just talking about this right now, but I'm thinking to myself already, man, there's a couple things that we've talked about as a team that are super important to us that we should just put on a fat poster in the shop, right? It should be in, whatever size 255 font and printed out on the massive banner, right? Just because I know for myself, it's going to be really helpful to look up on the wall and see that thing that we all decided to do as a team and remind myself of what we're trying to accomplish as a program.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. We see it I anecdotally, I see that a lot with sports teams, right? You think about sort of the very macho sort of whatever goals they may have above the lockers or whatever, but that's a really, truly a good thing to remind people every day about what you're trying to do.
Oh yeah, 100%. And there's a reason why teams do that, right? Yep. It helps build team cohesion, gets everyone on the same page, working towards a common goal. Especially in massive programs like football teams and stuff like that, you see that sort of that camaraderie and that common purpose is super important when you're running such a large organization. And FRC teams, in a way, are very similar. Lots of specialization, lots of different roles to fill, and everyone needs to be doing their part. So we talked about setting a schedule. Another great trigger to talking about your team goals is after every event. So events tend to be some of the most intense times in a team season, right? It's often one of the few times that you're traveling together as a team. So you're spending a lot more time together. Frankly, you're a lot of that team development process happens at events just because of the number of hours and the level of adrenaline and intensity that's going on. So it's important to check in afterwards and say, hey, we have a lot of these goals. Some of them were competition based, but overall, our team is still a team when we go to a competition. So we should be trying to meet all of our goals in some way or another while we're, on the road at events. So sit down after an event and do a debrief, right? And specifically focus on your stated team goals from back in August and say, hey, how did we do with all these things? With measuring goals, there's no shame in missing a goal. I would say, maybe if you're missing all of your goals every year, you need to be doing a better job setting goals or a better job tracking your goals through the season. But goals are a combination of something that's reasonable, but also stretching. And so you're not going to hit that 100% of the time. And that's a reality of it. But it's important to recognize when you meet your goals and then also recognize when you don't meet your goals. That's going to help inform your team's future goal setting down the road, either be that season or going into the next year. So I say, the big shame here would be if you didn't evaluate your goals at all, right? And evaluate why maybe you didn't reach your goal. So if you know that, hey, our goal was to make it to the quarterfinals at both of our events, and we made it to one, and our second district event, we missed the quarterfinals, right? I know for myself personally, if something doesn't go well, a lot of times, I kind of just want to move on and not look at it at all, right? And that can be the temptation. But this is not the time to do that. You want to spend some time evaluating. Hey, do a debrief. Say, hey, what happened, right? This was our goal. We thought we were tracking well for it, and then the track went on, or the train went off the rails at our second event. What went on there? So maybe there were factors outside of your control that caused that missing the goal. I think the big thing here is missed goals aren't just missed goals, and they're learning opportunities. So they can't be learning opportunities if you don't seek to make them that. So take the time, do debriefs, talk about those missed goals, and say, what can we do next event or next year to meet that goal? That's an important aspect to this goal setting process.
So, Mike, would you also suggest teams do a similar process for the goals they do achieve, or is there more to be learned from the misses than the hits?
I guess if teams are willing to put in the time, every goal is worthwhile to break down why things went well. Mm-hmm. Thinking back on it now, actually, we should probably be doing more of that too, because I think at a certain time, teams with long histories and certain things that they do year over year, maybe at some point, newer team members have kind of forgotten what it took to meet that goal year over year, right? Like our summer camps, for example, right? It's, we have successful camps year over year because we have great student leaders that are organizing the camps and doing signups and promotions and things like that. And, if we set a goal for ourselves and we meet that goal, but we're not talking about how we met that after everything's happened, then maybe we forget the secret sauce that made that possible in the first place. So that's a really good point. Yeah. I should probably, put some thought into revising these, because I think that's a great element to add into this equation. Okay, so that's the conclusion of the structured presentation, but hopefully we have like 10 minutes or something like that for questions, Francis.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you guys have questions for Mike, go ahead and send them in with the command !Q followed by your question in the chat, and we'll put them up on the air. So we've got a whole bunch of questions in here. We're going to take a few of them. So first up, we got our first question. This comes to us from this is 90man54, and he asks, how do you resolve when goals in multiple areas such as student or community impact and robot performance are competing for team resources?
This is a great question, and I'm glad Evan brought it up. So I would say there's a couple ways to address this. The big thing is we're talking about setting these goals as like the key stakeholders in hopefully what is like a focused process for your team. I picture for on 1678 it'd be our leadership group of a couple mentors and about 9 student leaders that are sitting in a room and talking through these things. When you look at your available resources versus competing goals, the first thing I'd say is, sometimes maybe looking at things from a different perspective might show that those goals maybe don't compete quite as much as you would think they would. But maybe there needs to be some reframing in one or both of those goals in order to for them to be a little bit more cohesive. So, I'm not sure exactly what that looks like, team to team. He mentioned specifically, student community impact and robot performance, right? And, to be honest, this is something that we talk about on 1678 all the time. And I actually have kind of a unique perspective on this. One that I think, we've been able to kind of hold to as a whole team is our ability to compete well has actually furthered our community impact, not taken away from it. And our drive for success has actually propelled us to be able to do more things than we ever did before we were a competitive team. And I'll say the key element to that really is the students that come through our program. They make that whole process possible. And I think the cool part about, what I love about being a mentor on 1678 is I get to see kids that initially come in to be energized and excited about competing on a great robotics team and building an awesome robot, right? And they end up taking that drive that they learned from being a part of this program and applying that same level of excellence and drive to how we run summer camps and how we do outreach at our FRC events. And because they're taking that same level of excellence into other areas of the program, we're doing way more now than we ever could have if we weren't also a team that tried to be competitive on the field, because the students are taking that same attitude.
That's really cool. That's awesome. That makes me very fulfilled to hear as a mentor, right? That's exactly what you want to see, right? So
exactly.
Yeah. This question comes from Firmtisk48. They ask, how specific do goals have to be?
I would say, we've gone through a lot of examples that are pretty great examples. Whenever you can try, I think there's two elements to this. You could just have specific goals being talking about very specific things, and that isn't necessarily always needed. But I think with the goals that you set, it's important to try to think about specific ways to measure those goals. So maybe those are two different topics to talk about. But I don't really have strong opinions on how specific your goals should be set. But I do think that wherever you can, try to have at least one measurable data point that you can pull out as a guiding principle for the team. Okay. Even if it's a broad goal, right? If your broad goal is we want to inspire students to pursue STEM, right? But maybe one specific goal that you actually measure is how many of them study STEM in college. So things like that.
Cool. All right. This one's coming in from Karthik1114, and he's asking, how can teams learn how to set appropriate goals, i.e. goals that push boundaries but are also realistically attainable?
I'm going to say listen to Karthik's talk on that one. No, the thing that I think helps more than anything is looking back at your own team's history. And then secondly, the great thing about FRC is there's so many other teams that have gone down the same path your team's about to go down in whatever area you're trying to improve in this program. And so reach out to other teams that maybe one or two steps down the road from you, right? And say, hey, we're 10 people right now. We'd love to be a 25-person team, in the next couple of years. How did you do it, right? And talk to teams next to you, talk to teams down the road and say, hey, we'd love to chat for an hour and understand about this one element of your team. How did you get to do what you did? And then set goals based off of that, right? Basically, yeah, learn from other people in your area, learn from other teams, and use that to inform how you set your own team goals.
Great. All right, we're going to do one last question here before we end for the afternoon here. This comes from Dare, and they're asking, how should a team handle setting goals for districts versus worlds? For example, being in a weaker district and having to compete at worlds where it's a completely different skill level.
Yeah, that's tough. I think that's teams that compete in really tough districts and areas, they obviously have the difficulty of having to fight through that level of competition every year, but they also have the huge advantage of being pushed even harder so that when they come to Worlds, they end up kind of on the whole being a little bit more prepared. If you feel like you're coming from a weaker area, a weaker region, kind of the onus becomes on you to pull up the level of competition. And this can look like a bunch of different things, but one of the great things I've seen certain areas do, and they've been, so I couldn't list any specific examples right now, but there's some great examples of regional like teams in regions that have formed together, like kind of like alliances, so to speak, of teams that will practice together.
Yeah.
They set up shared practice facilities because they recognize that they want all their teams in their area to get better. So, and that's one way that it's not just like building a good robot. It's about how you set up your community to enable that success. So consider models like that, like reach out more, build a stronger community in your own area that you can push each other to be stronger. So maybe your district isn't a weaker district when viewed in Worlds in a couple of years, right? And I think we've seen areas in FIRST that have done that pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, the first that comes to mind is like Georgia with their sort of like path to Einstein they were doing for a number of years that sort of ended up working out for them in that respect. So
yeah, really cool stuff.
Yeah. All right, well, that's all the time we have today. But Mike, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I learned a lot from what you presented to us today. I'm really eager to help apply it to my team, and I hope everybody else watching is as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Francis. It was a great time.
Absolutely. Coming up next in just a few minutes, we've got 5 of the Championship Woody Flowers Award winners. They're going to be presenting today to talk about what the Woody Flowers Award is all about, why they think it's important, and answer your questions here in the chat. So make sure you stay tuned for that. You don't want to miss it. So we'll be back in just a couple of minutes, and I hope to see everybody else here real soon.
Understood that we could not